I've learned that grief has a second life. When the funeral is over and the casseroles stop arriving, grief changes its shoes and becomes something else. It becomes quiet. It becomes a chair at the table no one sits in anymore. It becomes the sound of a clock when the house is too still. That was my life in Maine after my husband died. Tidy, simple, and full of a silence that had manners. My son visited on Sundays at first. He'd bring coffee, I'd bake muffins, and we'd talk about small things so the big things didn't win. He'd fix a squeaky hinge. I'd slip $20 into his jacket pocket like I used to when he was a teenager. And the ocean would knock against the shore with that patient old rhythm that never changes. We carried each other that way. Then he met her. I wanted to like her. The first time she came by, the gulls were loud and the sky was the color of a pearl. She had a scarf tied neatly at the neck and eyes that never stopped taking inventory. I made tea. She didn't drink it. I handed her a sweater when the wind turned. She said she didn't feel the cold. I asked what flowers those were by the steps, and I said lupines, and she said, "Oh, we don't plant wild things." We. I wondered how many decisions had already become we before I was told about any of them. Before I go further, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I always imagine the ocean carrying these words farther than I can. Maine is small. The world isn't. They started coming less on Sundays. He'd say work was heavy. She'd say there was a yoga retreat. Sometimes they'd arrive together but leave separately. He started looking at his phone when he laughed, like the permission to be happy belonged to whoever was on the screen. I tried not to be old-fashioned about it. Grief can make you possessive. I put his favorite blanket on the back of the couch. I baked the muffins he loved when he was 10 and always burned his tongue on. I left the porch light on. Mothers have 1,000 ways of saying, "This door is still yours." One afternoon in late spring, she came by without him. Her shoes hardly made a sound on the stairs. She smiled like people smile when they've practiced it in a mirror. We sat at the kitchen table. The kettle hummed in the background, and the ocean breathed in and out like a sleeping animal. She complimented the house in a way that felt like an evaluation. She asked if I was lonely in all this space. She used her fingertips to straighten the edge of the tablecloth until it was perfect. "You're lucky to have her," I said. She pressed her lips together. "We're lucky to have each other," she replied, and I felt the we slot into place like a key. If you've ever loved someone and felt yourself backing out of the doorway to make room for their future, press a small heart below so I know you understand. It helps, somehow, to see those little lights. I began noticing details. A box in his trunk marked registry. A white dress bag tucked behind coats in the back seat. A cousin who mentioned next month and then swallowed her words as if they were hot. I heard the word venue spoken softly, like a secret you whistle. When I asked my son, he grinned quick and said nothing was final, nothing to tell. He didn't want to jinx things. He kissed my cheek and smelled like cedar and someone else's detergent. I tried not to hold my questions the way you hold a grass, careful not to break anything. I asked if I should save a Saturday, any Saturday. He said, "Ma, don't be dramatic. We're not those people." But sometimes the people you raised become a version of themselves you don't recognize in certain lighting. A week later, I received a group text from a number I didn't have saved. It was a photo of a centerpiece. Peonies and candles in a low bowl, pale silk ribbon winding through the stems. Underneath a comment, "Too much?" Another, "More gold." The small dots danced and stopped and danced again. I typed the words, "Is there a date?" Then I erased them. Sometimes silence is the only dignity you can afford. Tell me honestly, What would you have asked? Or would you have waited the way I did? I read your comments. They make the room feel less empty. My church ladies started speaking in careful sentences. Are you excited for the summer? They asked, and then immediately offered me pie. One neighbor brought over a stack of old magazines and put them on the table like a peace offering. I opened one and found a torn-out page tucked inside. Lace veils for coastal weddings. It might have fallen there by accident. Or maybe the world drops its hints in paper so we don't forget the cut. I cleaned the house like I was expecting company. My husband used to call it putting the corners back, the way you push furniture with your hip until a room tells the truth again. I washed the good glasses. I pressed the dress I wore to my niece's wedding. A soft blue he once said made my eyes look like low tide. I set the earrings in a dish by the sink and practiced putting them on without tremor. I told myself it would be a small ceremony, a simple thing. Maybe they wanted to pay for it without my help. Maybe they were embarrassed about money. Maybe she had a complicated family. Mothers are the best at writing reasons that don't hurt when they read them aloud. One morning, I saw them through the grocer's window. He held a small white box in his hands, the kind with a ring. She laughed with her head tipped back, her hand light on his arm in a way that said, "That's mine." I stood in the freezer aisle a minute too long and came home with frost on my sleeves. That evening he called. "We're swamped this weekend, Ma. Can we do next week?" he asked, and I heard the plural in my bones. The porch light was already burning. I turned it off. If you're still here, would you tell me where you're listening from? It steadies me to imagine your towns and kitchens and the different kinds of sky you have. I started walking more, down to the pier in the mornings before the world had fully chosen its mood. Fishermen waved. Someone's radio played an old song my husband loved, steel guitar that sounded like a memory when you touch it. I sat on the bench with the paint flaking off and watched the gulls argue with the tide. The lighthouse looked the way old things do when they've decided to outlast loss. On my way back one day, I passed a storefront I hadn't noticed in years, a small photography studio, windows trimmed in white. In the display were newlyweds in fields, a grandfather's hands cupping a baby's feet, a mother and son laughing in a kitchen. There was a card taped to the glass that read, "We capture what the heart keeps." I stood there longer than I meant to, feeling the words settle. I almost went inside. I almost asked, "Do you know their names?" But I walked home instead, and when the phone rang later, it was no one. I tried to buy a dress online. Everything arrived either too young or like a curtain. I sent them back and told myself it didn't matter what I wore because he would look for me in the crowd and see me first, the way he always had in school auditoriums and on soccer fields, the way his little hand used to rise and wave above a sea of other small hands because he knew I was there, the way he always found me by instinct, like a bird does the shore. Then June came in on a warm wind and no date followed behind it. I went to the post office more than I needed to. The clerk said, "Anything good today?" And I said, "Just bills and coupons." And the bell at the door chimed too cheerfully for the truth of things. What I remember next is not a date, but a sound. Laughter in the distance, carried oddly far by the air. It came from the direction of the marina. I stood on my porch and listened. Music, a fork on glass, that particular lustrous noise people make when they've agreed it's a beautiful day. I told myself it was a fundraiser, a birthday. I told the truth 100 times in a row, and the world kept answering with something else. By evening, the wind shifted and I smelled roses, the kind they order in bulk. I didn't cry that night. I'd learned not to. I sat at the kitchen table, folded a tea towel the way my mother taught me, and smoothed the edges until no corner argued. The lamp made a small, dignified circle of light on the wood. I placed a pen in the center of it and thought about names. I thought about mine and how I had worn it for so long I'd forgotten it had an owner. If this has ever happened to you, if the news of a life moment arrived everywhere but your door, leave me a small moon or a star below. It's a way of saying, I see you, without taking more than you can give. On Sunday, my cousin Ruth called and spoke like a person walking through a dark room. She asked about the garden. She told me her cat had started sleeping in the laundry basket. She told me a joke she wasn't sure how to finish. Then, too softly, she asked, "Have you talked to him today?" I said, "No, but I'm sure he's busy." And she said, "I'm sure he is too." I could hear her husband whisper in the background. Ruth is not a good liar. I thanked her for the call and told her the lupines were especially blue this year. We both wore our small dignities like coats. I set 2 plates on the table that night out of habit. Then I put one back. I ate standing up at the sink, the way people do when the chair feels like a commitment. I looked at the ring I still wore and wondered if love was a house or the wind that moves through it. The next morning was what I think of now as the quiet before the truth. The sunlight came in thin and honest. The goals were busy, the tide agreeable. The phone sat where it always sits by the window and behaved like a good guest. I watered the plants and told them they were doing fine. I walked from room to room, placing small things where small things belonged. When the mail arrived, there was nothing in it for me from anyone who loved me. There was a flyer for a lobster festival. There was a coupon for paint. There was a charity asking for the kind of generosity I used to have without thinking. I set them in a neat pile and straightened the edges. And then I heard a voice from the yard next door. The neighbor's daughter was home from college, her words bright and generous in the air. She said, "The photos turned out perfect." And the other voice, her mother's, said, "Of course they did. It was a lovely wedding." I stood at the sink and looked at my hands. They were steady. They were not old when they held a whisk or a steering wheel. They were not old when they folded a boy's laundry and checked his pockets for gum and stones. I finished my coffee and washed the cup. I dried it with the towel I'd folded the night before. I placed it in the cupboard in the spot where it lives. It felt heroic to place something where it belongs. If you're still here, would you tap subscribe so I know we're walking together a little longer? I keep my voice steady for you when I can't for myself. The day darkened early, as if the weather had been warned. The house made its small noises, a pipe settling, a frame sighing, the clock complying with time. I sat in the chair by the window and listened to the road, to the ocean making its unending deal with the shore. And then the phone rang. I didn't rush. I let it ring once more than I needed to, the way you do when you want the next moment to feel like a choice. I lifted the receiver and said, "Hello?" The voice on the other end was gentle, almost musical, and didn't know it was about to open a door that had been nailed shut. "Hello?" the voice said. "I'm the photographer. I've been trying to reach you. I just need your address to deliver the wedding album." I looked at the light on the floor. It did what light does. It did not defend anyone. It did not apologize. It simply told the truth of what it touched. "Whose wedding?" I asked, though my mouth already knew. My heart had heard days ago. "Their wedding," she said, and spoke my son's name carefully, as if it were something breakable and borrowed. I wrote my address down as if it belonged to a woman who knew where she stood. I thanked her for calling. I put the phone back exactly in its place. Then I sat very still and let the ocean finish a sentence it had started years ago. If you've ever learned the truth from a stranger, leave me a small wave below. I want to see the shoreline we share. I slept without dreams that night. Morning would come, and with it, a book of pictures I was supposed to recognize. Morning came with a thin kind of light, the kind that doesn't promise anything. The phone sat where I'd left it, quiet, polite, pretending it hadn't told me what it told me. Outside, the gulls called each other by name, and somewhere down the road a dog barked, loyal to its own routine. Everything ordinary went on as if nothing had changed. Everything inside me had. I made coffee, because that's what you do when the world has turned but you haven't yet. Steam rose, faint and honest, and for a moment I pretended the phone call was a dream. But dreams don't leave ink on notepaper, and there it was, my own handwriting, the photographer's name, the word album circled once. Before I go further, tell me in the comments where you're listening from this morning. I like imagining your kitchens, your living rooms, your corners of the world that still feel safe. Sometimes it helps to picture a light on somewhere else. At noon, the mail truck stopped outside. The driver waved, set a parcel by the gate, and drove away. It was brown, paper-wrapped, tied with twine, no return address. My name spelled neatly in black ink. I knew before I opened it. Inside was a leather-bound book, cream pages, heavy. It smelled of roses and salt, the smell of money and the sea. I sat at the table where I'd once iced birthday cakes and turned the first page. The cover photo was my son, his arm around her shoulders, a church behind them I'd never stood in, ribbons, rings, laughter caught in stills I had never been invited to breathe. I went through each picture slowly, him adjusting his tie, her father walking her down the aisle, my son's face, the same face I'd taught to tie those ties when he was 15 and late for a dance. There was no empty chair in the crowd, no sign that I had ever existed, just a sea of faces smiling the same practiced smile. If you've ever seen proof of something beautiful that you were meant to be part of but weren't, leave me a small, broken heart below. It's a way of saying me too, without saying anything at all. Halfway through the album, I stopped. There, tucked behind the tissue paper, was a note, typed, not handwritten. We wanted to keep it small, didn't want you to feel pressured to travel or dress up. Hope you understand. No signature, just initials that weren't mine. I laughed once, quietly. Understanding was the one thing I'd never been short on. It's respect that had gone missing. I closed the book and placed it on the table. The afternoon light fell across it like a verdict. Later that day, I walked down to the pier. The wind had turned sharper. Boats swayed in their ropes, small gestures of agreement with the tide. A man mending nets nodded at me, and I nodded back. We were two people patching holes in different kinds of fabric. When I got home, I sat at my husband's old desk and opened the drawer that still smelled faintly of cedar and tobacco. Inside was the box of letters he'd written during his deployments, creases worn soft from years of reading. He had once written, "If I ever go before you, promise you'll still stand tall." I whispered, "I'm trying." If you're still listening, tell me in the comments what words you hold on to when you need to stay upright.
I read them later when the nights get long. That evening, the phone rang again. Her voice, the bride, sweetened, careful. "Hi, I just wanted to check. You got the album?" I said yes. "Oh, good," she said. "We didn't want you to feel left out." I could hear music behind her, laughter, glasses clinking. They were still celebrating. I asked, "Was it a good day?" She said, "Perfect. The best day of our lives." Then she hesitated. "I hope you're not upset." And I said, "No, I'm not upset. I'm educated." Silence. Then the line went dead. After that, days blurred. Neighbors waved, mail came, seagulls complained about the weather. Life, that stubborn thing, went on. But I started to notice a new sound in my head, a quiet hum of intention, a plan taking shape like a tide turning beneath still water. I went through old photographs, not to hurt myself, but to remember the truth of what love looked like when it was simple. Him at 5, missing a tooth, holding up a fish bigger than his arm. Him at 12, face red from running, yelling, "Mom, watch!" Him at 18, shaking his father's hand the day he left for college. The face in those pictures didn't know how to lie. I realized then, people change shape, but love leaves fingerprints, and those don't fade, even when they're ignored. If you're still here, tap the like button. It tells me you're walking beside me through this part. Stories like ours are heavy. We carry them better together. The following Sunday, I put on my coat, drove to town, and stood outside the church they'd used. The doors were open for the morning service. Inside, candles flickered like small confessions. I didn't go in. I stood at the back, breathing in the leftover perfume of celebration, the ghost of flowers and vows. A woman in the last pew smiled at me and handed me a bulletin. She asked, "Are you visiting?" I said, "Just passing through." When I came home, I laid the bulletin on the kitchen counter beside the album, 2 records of a truth I didn't write. Then I took a blank notebook and wrote the date on the first page. Under it, I wrote one sentence: "You can't erase a mother by forgetting to invite her." That was the moment my sorrow began to change shape. It didn't vanish, it evolved into resolve, into something clean. If you've ever had to build your dignity from scraps, leave me a HEART in the comments. I see you, and we're not done yet. By evening, I called Ruth. She answered on the first ring. "I saw the photos," I said. She said, "I know. I'm so sorry." I told her, "Don't be. They made a choice. I'm making mine." She didn't ask what it was. Good friends don't pry. They wait. I spent that night at the desk again, the album open beside a stack of blank envelopes. I took one photo, just one of my son smiling, happy, unguarded, his arm around her. I slipped it into an envelope and addressed it to myself. Inside, I wrote a short note. "For the record, I'm still here." I mailed it the next morning. Sometimes a gesture only makes sense to the soul that sends it. If you're still here, subscribe before we go further. There's more ahead, and I want you with me when the tide turns. Because the next part isn't about losing. It's about what you learn to hold when everything else lets go.
The ocean was louder that week, as if it had opinions. I'd sit by the window and listen to the waves arguing with the rocks and think, yes, I know the feeling. Grief has an echo, but dignity has a pulse. I could feel mine returning, slow and certain. Every morning I made the same ritual: coffee, window, pen. On the table lay the album, the note, and my blank notebook. 3 versions of truth. One written by them, one written by silence, and one waiting for me to write. If you're listening right now, take a moment and breathe with me. What would you write on the first page after heartbreak? Tell me in the comments when you know. I read them when the nights feel long. I started with small sentences. He was loved. He was taught to hold doors and say please. He forgot for a while, but forgetting isn't forever. Writing it didn't fix the wound, but it stopped it from spreading. On Wednesday, I drove to the florist in town. The woman behind the counter recognized me. She asked if I needed funeral flowers or something brighter. I said, something that forgives. She handed me lilies and rosemary. I took them to the cemetery and set them beside my husband's stone. I didn't get invited, I told him, but I went in my own way. The wind lifted my hair like a blessing. And just like that, the ache changed texture. It became bearable. That evening, Ruth stopped by with pie. She didn't mention the wedding. She just sat across from me, fork tapping the rim of her plate. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. She said, "You could still call him." "I could," I replied, "but he wouldn't hear the right part of my voice yet." She nodded. "Then wait until he can." If you've ever chosen silence instead of shouting, drop me a small moon below. That's what patience looks like, dark and steady. 2 days later, I received a letter. The return address was a hotel in Portland. Inside was a single line in my son's handwriting. "I'm sorry, Ma. Can we talk?" I stared at it until the ink felt alive. Then I folded it once, tucked it into my pocket, and walked down to the water. The tide was out. Wet sand gleamed like glass. I thought about all the apologies the world owes itself. Quiet, late, but still worth something. I didn't rush to answer. Instead, I spent that night remembering the boy before the man, the freckles, the gap in his smile, the way he used to fall asleep with a toy boat in his hand. The next morning, I called. He answered on the first ring. "Hi, Ma." The voice was cautious, younger somehow. I shouldn't have let her. I stopped him gently. We both let things happen. What matters is what we learn. There was a long pause. Then he asked, "Can I come by?" I said yes. I spent the day cooking, not out of habit, but hope. Chowder on the stove, bread rising slow, table set for 2. At sunset, his car pulled in. He stood at the gate like someone unsure of the rules. I opened the door before he could knock. He looked tired, eyes red at the edges. "Ma, I don't know what to say." "Start with hello," I told him. We sat at the table where the album had lived for weeks. He saw it immediately and winced. "She thought it would hurt less that way," he said. "It didn't, but I survived worse." He reached for my hand. "Can you forgive us?" I already did. Forgiveness is how I remember who I am. If you're still with me, leave a small herb below. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the sound a lock makes when it opens. He ate 3 bowls of chowder like a child home from school. He told me about work, about the house they'd rented, about Emma, his stepdaughter now,
who loved sea glass and hated bedtime. I listened. I let the rhythm of his voice stitch the distance closed. When he left, he hugged me longer than he had in years. He whispered, "You should meet her again, properly this time." I said, "When the tide's right." He smiled. He knew what that meant. After he drove off, I went to the window. The moon had climbed high, silver on the water. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt balanced. The next week, I received another package. This one was smaller, wrapped in blue paper. Inside was a frame, a single photo from their wedding, not the posed one. This was different. It was my son standing alone outside the church door, looking off toward the sea. No smile, just thought. Underneath, written in her handwriting, were 3 words: "We were wrong." I set it on the mantel beside my husband's portrait. 2 moments of truth side by side, and in the space between them, forgiveness took its seat. If this part of the story gave you a little breath of hope, tap the like button. It helps this story find others who need to know peace can still arrive. That night, I wrote one more line in my notebook. Justice doesn't always punish. Sometimes it simply restores. And I closed the book.
Spring settled in slow, like a guest who knows how to behave. The ocean stopped arguing with the rocks. It just breathed. Each morning the light reached a little farther into the house, touching corners that had been patient through winter. Forgiveness doesn't happen all at once. It arrives in teaspoons, one soft moment at a time. I started to notice the small ones, the way the kettle sang instead of hissed, the way the mail no longer felt like bad news, the way my husband's chair no longer looked empty, just resting. If you're still listening, tell me in the comments what peace looks like where you live. Mine smells like salt and coffee. A few weeks after that last letter, they came. Both of them. He knocked. She stood behind him holding lilies, the same kind I'd left at the grave. For a second, we were 3 strangers rehearsing something holy. Then I opened the door wider. We didn't talk about the album or the silence or the call. We talked about the weather, the bakery that closed, the new boardwalk cafe. Small words that meant we're trying. When she finally said, "I'm sorry," it sounded like it had traveled a long way to reach me. I nodded. "Thank you for the flowers." They filled the room with the same scent as forgiveness. If you've ever chosen to stay gentle when anger was easier, leave a yellow flower below. That's strength in its quietest form. They stayed for dinner. I told stories about his father, how he once got lost fishing in fog and found his way back by following a single bellboy. My son laughed the way he used to, shoulders shaking, eyes shining. She laughed too, carefully at first, then freely. When they left, she hugged me. It wasn't long, but it was real. And that's enough. After they drove away, the house felt different again. Not empty, just full of air that belonged to all of us. I walked from room to room, turning off lights and whispering goodnight, as if the house were a child, finally asleep. Summer arrived early that year. Tourists returned, gulls got louder, the ice cream stand reopened. I volunteered at the library twice a week, reading to children about faraway oceans and brave little sailors. Sometimes Emma came with them. She'd sit cross-legged on the rug, listening hard, her small fingers curled around a shell I'd given her. When she smiled up at me, I thought, that's the real inheritance. If you're still here, leave a small heart below so I know you've made it with me to the calm. You'd be amazed how many people find each other at the end of stories like this. One afternoon, she, the daughter-in-law, stayed behind while my son took Emma for ice cream. She looked around the house and said softly, "I see why he missed this place." I handed her a cup of tea and said, "Now you know where he learned patience." We both laughed, and something invisible shifted, a door opening inside a door. Before she left, she said, "You should come visit us sometime." I told her I might, and for the first time, I meant it. That evening, I walked down to the pier again. The tide was high, the sun was melting into the horizon. I thought about how many times I'd stood there counting what I'd lost. Now I counted what remained. One house, one heart, one lesson. Love that survives disappointment becomes something steadier than joy. It becomes peace. If you've ever rebuilt your peace from scratch, tell me with a single word in the comments. Still. I stopped at the photo studio on my way home. The window display had changed. Families, graduations, a couple holding a newborn. I went inside. The same woman who had called months ago looked up. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I'd like to book a session." She smiled. "For what occasion?" "Just life," I answered. "Just what's left." The photos came a week later. Me on the porch, hair a little wild, sea wind in the frame. No filters, no pretending, just truth caught in good light. I framed one and sent it to my son with a note for the album that was missing a page. He called the next day, voice bright. "It's perfect, Ma," he said. And I realized maybe we were all learning how to start over. Now the nights are softer. I read before bed, write a line or two in my notebook, and thank the house for keeping me company. Sometimes I still hear the ocean talking outside, steady and endless. It doesn't promise happiness. It promises rhythm. That's enough. If this story found you tonight, let it remind you, being left out doesn't mean being left behind. Some invitations arrive late, written in the language of healing. And remember, here on True Life Stories, we don't just tell stories, we remember them. We keep the silence company until it learns how to sing again. Thank you for listening to mine.